Hi there. Welcome to the Sober Circle channel. Enjoy this speaker tape.
We contacted some time ago, and when I got his letter back, and from the extent of the way it sounded and everything, I sized him up to be a big roaring person, something similar to myself. And there was a couple of, about a half a day around here before I could finally find him. But since I finally met him and got acquainted with him, it's just only been through the handshake. I haven't asked him anything. I don't want to tell his stories. No need in me asking him a whole lot of different things because I let him save that for you. I'd louse it up for him. I have a hard time telling my own story. At this time, I will give you our final speaker for this convention, Dave B. from Montreal County.
Thank you very much, Bud. I'm an alcoholic. My name is Dave Bancroft. Before I start to tell you about myself, perhaps I'd better give you the greeting of an old friend of yours, but an even older friend of mine. Her name is Margaret Foster. She called me a couple of nights ago, or 3 nights ago, from Algonquin, Maine, and she was heartbroken. She said, "Dave, be sure you go down there and give them my love." And that's what I'm doing now. I'd like to give you, I was going to say first, the greetings of Canada. But you know that's really not right. Because in AA we don't have borders. I feel just as much at home here or in California or anywhere else as I do in Winnipeg. Because you walk into a room and it's a feeling of AA. I wish the whole world could get this. We wouldn't have the problems that we have now. And so I'll just say, I bring you the greetings of the groups up in my part of the AA world. I suppose I was always an alcoholic. I heard somebody say here the other night that most of us could remember the first drink that we ever took. Well, I can remember the first drink that I ever took. I can remember it very well because it did something to me. And I suppose now it was something that it didn't do to other people, the so-called normal people. I was at school at the time, a boarding school, and we were in town that afternoon, and I can remember that I was with some of the older boys, and we walked past a hotel in town, and somebody said, "Let's go in and have a beer." I'd never had a beer before, or any kind of a drink, really. I don't know why I hadn't. There weren't any other alcoholics in our family, and liquor wasn't a forbidden thing or anything like that. I just never had one. But somehow or another, I felt inside me that this thing wasn't right to do. But then again, I had something that seems to be pretty common to most of us. I lacked a thing called moral courage. Guts, I guess you'd call it. I didn't have the gumption to say no. I was afraid these people might think the less of me. They think that I was afraid. And so I went in and I had a drink. I was small. I was shy. I wasn't too good at games or at my studies. You know, that first glass of beer I had opened up a whole new world for me. I didn't have to be that shy little guy. I didn't have to be afraid. I could be all the things that I wanted to be. I was quite a dreamer, too, and that's another thing that's common to a great many of us. I can remember going back to school. I can remember the youngsters around the school saying, "Did you smell Bancroft? He's been drinking." And I can remember that made me the big wheel. Everybody was talking about me, and I loved that. I don't suppose that was a very good experience for me to have. Perhaps if it had stayed like that and just relieved the shyness, it might have been all right. But alcohol never stays like that with people like me who are alcoholics. It grows and it grows until it becomes an old man of the sea on your back that you can't escape from any way at all. At least that's the way it was with me. I learned a tremendous lesson from that. I went back to Quebec where my father had a job at the Bank of Montreal. That was another thing. All my life it had been drummed into me. There's been a Bancroft in the Bank of Montreal since the day it opened its doors in 1817. You're the one who's going to follow in my footsteps. You're the one who's going to carry that name on through. You know, I always had a feeling I'll never really be able to do it. I can't do the things these other people did. I'm going to let them down. But you know, you couldn't let people on the outside. I think most of us, or I myself anyway, are twin personalities. We're kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Inside, I was afraid, and I knew I couldn't really do it. But on the outside was a kind of rebellion and a defiance, and you'd never let people know what was going on inside of you. So I was a kind of two people. Oh, I got to be known as that wild Bancroft boy around Quebec, and how I loved that. I got into various scrapes. They weren't really too bad, but I noticed something as I think back. I think I was an alcoholic right from the start because other people would go out and they'd have a good time, even get drunk once in a while. But to them, that was the end of it. And if they only had 2 or 3 drinks, that was it. That was all right, but it wasn't all right with me. I always felt as if the evening was unfinished. There was something missing. There was something to come. But it didn't come. I left Quebec. I got into a scrape. Oh, it wasn't a very serious scrape. The old story is sowing his wild oats. And I got transferred down to the maritime provinces, which are just north of Maine. And everywhere I went, I would only stay for a little while, and then I suppose the manager would get me transferred out of there, and always it was the same reason. He's young, he's sowing his wild oats, he's getting in with bad companions. And I was transferred around 4 or 5 branches through the maritime provinces. It never struck me as strange, I suppose, or anybody else, that all the branches and all the places I ever went to, I was always getting in with bad companions. It never struck anybody that there was one thing constant in all those places, and that was me. Finally, I was transferred out of that area altogether over into the Hamilton, Ontario area. I remember starting to drink in Montreal. I can remember getting in the train pretty drunk. Had a fur coat in those days. The old man had bought it. I can remember waking up in the berth as the porter shaking me with a fur coat on and bottle each side of me, and he said, "You got to get off now." I can remember going up, of all places, I don't know why, to the YMCA and getting a room. It was right straight across the street from the bank. I had a very proud boast then. I was getting just a little bit defiant. People were saying, "Well, you're drinking a little bit too much." And wasn't always so much now that wild Bancroft boy. And I got defiant about that, and I would say it's my business if I drink. I've never missed a day's work. I've never been late, and it's my business if I drink. You look after your things, I look after mine. But that time something was different. I started drinking those 2 bottles, and I didn't get into work. And I didn't get into work the next day either. And finally the accountant of the bank came over and got me. I never could use that proud boast honestly again that alcohol didn't interfere with my life. I did use it. I used it many times because I did something that I got very used to and many alcoholics do. I just wanted to see the nice things about myself. I had a picture of the kind of guy I was. I didn't want to see the things that weren't good and the shady things. And those things I tucked way down deep in here so I wouldn't have to look at them. But once in a while they'd come out and you'd remember. I think really that was a turning point in my life. I was there for about a year and a half. I was transferred out to the Middle West, out to Winnipeg. And I can remember that so well. What a place that was. Everything was wide open. I lived upstairs over the bank, and it was cold as charity there. I worked downstairs, so I never went out. The only place I went was out through the back alley into the lane, through the lane, and into the old Corona Hotel. And that's the way I lived that winter. I still had a measure of control over my drinking because I liked playing golf, and that summer I cut down my drinking just about to the bottom because I couldn't do 2 things at once, and I wanted to play golf. Nobody was going to push me around. I remembered I'd been there about 9 months, and there was a young girl working in the bank during her summer vacation from school. She was 15 years old, and I fell very violently in love with this young lady, as emotional people do. And then one day I got transferred to Vancouver, British Columbia. So I can see it now. Everybody was trying to get me the farthest away they could from head office. But in those days, they've got a lot more now, but in those days they had about, I suppose, 5,000 or 6,000 employees, and they didn't even know my name. Whoever arranged these transfers, they just picked out a name, and he was there, and he was available, and he had the experience, and so they would send him. But I didn't think that. They were just picking on me. They did this because they knew I'd fallen in love with this young lady, and they just did it to spite me. We're pretty impulsive people. One of the things I've learned in AA is most of the time to think before I act. But in those days I acted before I thought. I can remember walking up Portage Avenue, big, wide western street, with Dory. Came to a place, Little Credit Jewelers. Well, there's another kind of thing. You feel insecure, and if I got out of there, maybe somebody else would take her away. And so we decided we would get engaged. And we stopped, talked to the little man that had the store. He brought out an engagement ring. It wasn't very good engagement ring, I must say, because I only had the expense money. And we decided on one, and then he said, "Well, why don't you take the wedding ring? It's only $5 more, and they come in sets." And so we took the wedding ring. And then he said, "Are you planning on getting married right away?" Well, I thought it hadn't entered our heads, to be honest with you. He said, "Well, if you are, here's a card of a minister who will marry you." This was in the days before the medical tests and so on. And so we got in a taxi and we went up and got married. I was 21. I was making $800 a year. And Dory was 15. You know, those aren't the acts of a responsible person. No, I can remember then the people, they started waiting and waiting and waited, and they waited 3 months, they waited 6 months, they waited 9 months, finally they waited 10 years. Wasn't really that at all. You know, that's another one of the tremendous rewards that Alcoholics Anonymous has given me. I left our house a couple of days ago. I waved goodbye to Dory. She's not 15 and I'm not 21. She weighs a lot more than that 95 pounds she used to then. But she was there. You know, sometimes my heart gets just so full of gratitude for the things that God has given me in Alcoholics Anonymous. Sometimes it's hard to control yourself. And I went out in the taxi and got on the plane. I was out this last fall to the Winnipeg Roundup, they call it up there, of Alcoholics Anonymous. I walked into the banquet hall and somebody said, "I hear you're from the East," and I said, "Yes." Said, "I'll tell you something that you'll never be able to match. There was an Easterner here one time, years ago, worked in the Bank of Montreal. You know, he stood up in that parapet way up there, let it stitch your clothes on him except a fur coat, a bottle in his pocket." I didn't say anything. But when I got up to tell my story, I told that one. And they got quite a kick out of that. But those are irresponsible things. I went out on that transfer to Vancouver. I didn't say a word to anybody because I was afraid. I was only making that $800 and you were supposed to have $1,200. And they were very fussy about that. And you know, after I got out there, you know how you are when you're worried and you're afraid, you start to drink. Then after a while I began to think, well, I'll have to do something. Something's got to be done. And so I wrote to my father. And perhaps this is another part of the things. He was terribly fond of me. My mother died when I was very young, and he was very proud, and he spoiled me terribly. I had never really had to face anything. Whenever I got into any kind of a jam, he had got me out of it. Well, this time I sat down and I wrote him a long, long letter, and I told him the whole story. And I got a letter back that said, "This time is something more than I can handle. You'll have to go up and tell the whole story to the superintendent of the bank." And I was afraid to do it, but I did. And then the whole world fell in. I was 3,000 miles from home and I was fired. My wife, Dory, told her father, and he took action against me for marrying his minor daughter without permission, and he took an action for annulment. I was in a spot. But it came through again. My father fixed it up with the bank, and they took me back on the temporary staff. He sent me a check for $500 so that we could get an apartment settled. He arranged with Dory's father to drop the charges and action against me. I got the $500. When Dory arrived out in Vancouver, and she was 16 by this time, a long way from home, I was in a hospital. I'd lost all the toes on one foot and broken my leg. I'd fractured my skull in an elevator accident, and there wasn't any more of the $500 left. There wasn't anywhere for her to go. And I was pretty ashamed. I can remember Vancouver. I can remember it so well. I can remember once coming down to the bank there, put my hands in my pocket, and I was the paying teller, and I couldn't find my keys. And so I waited until somebody opened the door, you know, most alcoholics are connivers. Fortunately, my cash was under combination down in the vaults downstairs. And I went down, turned off the combination, and I brought the cash upstairs, and I put it in my cage, and I put the snap on the lock so it wouldn't lock, and I went on like that for a couple of days till the accountant noticed that the keys were missing. He said, "Where are your keys?" And I said, "Well, I left them at home." And he said, "Well, you better have them." And the next day it was the same thing. He said, "Well, you know, we're going to have to change all the locks on the bank here, and that's a pretty expensive business, and we'll have to charge it to you. So what do you do when you're worried and you're despondent?" I was right down in the roughest part of Vancouver, down by the harbor. I went into a little hotel next door, and I got myself a drink. And the waiter said to me, "When are you going to give me that $5 you owe me?" I said, "What $5? He said, "The $5 I gave you for these keys here." I often thought what the Bank of Montreal would have thought if they'd known that the keys to their establishment were in hock to a waterfront tavern. I had my first blackout in Vancouver, and this frightened me. I came to one morning, apparently perfectly rational. I'm sitting in a police station across a desk from a police lieutenant, and I'm making application for a permit to carry a revolver. I didn't know what I wanted a revolver for. I didn't know why I was there. I didn't know anything about it, and I was terrified. I had a permit to carry a revolver while I was on the bank's business, and I made some kind of an excuse and got out of there as fast as I could. And after that, I tried to cut down my drinking, but it wasn't any good. You know, they have an old, most people who are non-alcoholics, they have an old theory that give him responsibility and he won't be able to drink, he won't have time, and he'll have too many other things on their mind. You know, that's just what I was running away from. They set me up as manager of a little wee branch up in the Hotel Vancouver. And pretty soon there were only two of us in the office. The girl was running the branch, and I was spending most of the time downstairs in the bar. You know, I'm a kind of a dreamer, a visionary, I guess, and I get down with all these people coming in from the South Sea Islands and across in Japan and Australia and India and all these places. We talk about all kinds of things, and I visualized myself over there, and oh, this was lovely. One day we got on a party in there, in the hotel, ended up in one of the rooms. We ran out of liquor, and somebody got a bottle of alcohol or a bottle of something, nobody knows what it was. And in the morning I woke up in the little wee apartment we had there in Vancouver, and I woke up in a bathtub. This was only a one-room apartment. When I came home like that, that's where Dory made me sleep. And I was fully clothed. And I had a kind of a feeling that something terrible was going to happen. I suppose you could say it was a sense of impending doom. I had that fear many times after that. But I also had the answer. I had a headache, too, and I rarely had headaches. Most alcoholics don't seem to have headaches. I got terribly sick, but not headaches, and this frightened me. The answer was in the icebox, and I went and got a bottle of beer that was in there, and I sat down in a chair, and I started to drink it. And the feeling of fear grew worse and worse. And there was good reason for it. All of a sudden, my whole side went pins and needles. My face was all drawn to one side, and I was really terrified. I called Dory. She was terrified, too, and called the doctor. And he came, and he took a look and a smell, put him in bed. He's got alcoholic neuritis. You know, these drunks, they drink and they don't eat. But it wasn't alcoholic neuritis. In a couple of days, the bank doctor came up to see me, and it turned out that I had had a cerebral hemorrhage. I was paralyzed all down one side. It seemed to me that this was the end of everything. I can remember lying in bed there. I can remember the checks that I had out all over this world that were coming back in the clearing envelopes from every place, missorted and so on and so forth. The loan company started coming back and demanding their money from the bank, and I was in serious trouble. This was a crisis in my life, another crisis in my life. You'd think a person would say to himself after this, I'm never going to drink again, no matter what. But I became a little more withdrawn. I became a little more bitter. I became a little more resentful of the world and a God that could do a thing like this to me. I was only 23. How could they do this to me? What had I left in my life? They sent me back some few months later when I could travel back to Montreal in disgrace. And I can remember the miserable job they gave me, and how I resented that, and how I began to hate everybody and everything. I can remember them taking me up to head office upstairs and saying, Dave, you know, you have ability, but you don't have stability. We can do with a lot less ability and a lot more stability. You know, when I speak of that, I can remember how bitter and resentful and hopeless I felt when I left Vancouver. That was the last time I saw that Pacific Ocean until last summer. Last summer I was out at the conference in California, and I had a little cabin right down by the beach, and that first night I was there, it was a beautiful night, and I walked out and stood on that beach, and I looked at that Pacific Ocean, and I thought of the most tremendous change that had come over me in those 30 years. Change which people can't explain by any other means than spiritual, and for me the philosophy of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I just felt so full of gratitude. I don't think I've ever felt more tremendous. It felt as if it would overflow right out of me for all the things that have been given to me over the past 17 years. I can remember after I got back, after a while, I was scared to drink. I didn't drink for nearly 6 months. After a while, I was able to discard the crutches, and I was able to walk with a cane. And I can remember one day getting off at the transfer point on the old streetcars, and the thought flashed through my mind, maybe these people are just trying to scare me from stopping drinking. They told me that perhaps I would die or be bedridden for the rest of my life if I drank again. And I went in and I drank a glass of beer, and then I drank a quart of beer. I didn't die. It made me think everybody in the world was a phony. Oh, I don't know whether I really thought that, but I said that. Let's put it like that. But I drank more and more. I never could hold as much after that. And they tried every way they could to help me. Everybody tried. I can remember them sending me up to a branch in Peel Street up, right, they call it the heart of Canada. I can remember walking in there with a cane. I can remember a man who did me one of the most tremendous favors that anybody has ever done me. I didn't think so then. He looked up from his desk, and he was the accountant. He said, "What the hell are they sending up here now? A bunch of cripples?" And I remember inside myself, it just welled up inside me. I'll show that guy. I'll show him. If it's the last thing I ever do in all my life, I'll show him. I'd never really learned to write with my left hand yet. I hadn't learned how really to get along. They took me and put me in the receiving teller's cage. And I can remember the first night I came out, and I listed all my checks and whatnot on the adding machine, went back in, and that's the way I bounced. But I learned to write. Wasn't too long till I could write with my left hand. Matter of fact, now I think I write better with it than I ever did with my right. It wasn't too long after that, another one of these stories of responsibility. No, Dory and I were alone. If we only had a child, that would be the answer. That's what we needed. I'm very fond of children. Always. No, Dory and I were alone. If we only had a child, that would be the answer. That's what we needed. I'm very fond of children. Always have been. And I can remember as the time drew near that all the preparations I made by tremendous strength of character. I had about that much left in a bottle. It was up on a shelf, and it was going to stay there till the time Dory said, "I've got to go to the hospital." I remember the night she said it. I was half loaded. She said, "We have to go." I can remember, "Phone the doctor," she said. I can remember shaking all over, and "I've got to get the drink first." I can remember by the time I got the drink that she had phoned the doctor. I can remember getting in the car of a neighbor of ours, having to stop at the hotel to buy some cigarettes, and coming out about an hour later, just about in time to get Dory up to the hospital. I can remember the shame I felt when they wouldn't let me stay in the hospital. I can remember the feelings I had that I couldn't go back and stay in that place alone. And I went to a hotel, and I just stayed there and drank. And I drank for about 3 days, and I came to and dirty, still with my clothes on. And I said to myself that I had to go up to the hospital. Just like all the other drunks, the grandiose kind of people, I didn't have any money, but I knew where I could charge up some flour. And I went and got a tremendous bunch of flowers. One of these things that you'd see in, well, if it were Montreal on Dominion Square on Armistice Day. And I got in the taxi, and I went up to the hospital. I don't remember too much of that. But Dory says she remembers a picture of me coming down the hall with this tremendous thing, dragging it behind me. But I can remember something. I can remember something, and I hope that I remember that. I hope a picture of it comes right up in front of my eyes if I'm ever tempted to pick up a glass and take a drink out of it. But she just took one look at me, and she burst into tears. And I went back there and just kept right on drinking. You'd think a person by this time would say, "I've had enough." Wasn't too long after that, the bank sent me up to a psychiatrist. Oh, I remember that so well. Here I was paying him $20 or something, sitting on the other side of the table, lying as hard as I could lie. He was never going to find out what went on inside me. After I'd been to him twice, he committed suicide. I never did go. I don't really think it had anything to do with me. I think he had family problems. And then I started going in, making the rounds of the hospitals. I can remember going in for the first treatment under some other name, taking a thing they called the belladonna treatment in those days. And it was rugged. Belladonna every hour, every half hour, every quarter hour. In the morning, a great big dose of Epsom salts. And about the third morning, you were ready to jump out the window when the nurse came in with it. I can remember coming out of there. Nobody ever told me then that I was an alcoholic. Nobody ever said you can't ever drink again. People said, well, now drink like other people do. Drink like a gentleman. Just keep a bottle in the house. Be ordinary. You don't have to be like that. Look at what you're doing to your wife and your child and your family and all the rest of it. I tried that. Well, you know the answer. Soon I was worse than ever, and I was back in that hospital again. And I was in and out of that hospital some 23 times. I can remember the last time I was in there. I can remember the determination I made to get home. With every ounce of strength that there was in me, I was going to get home. And I phoned Doreen out to come and get me, that I had to show myself and show everybody that I could do it. And I think I wanted to more than I ever wanted anything. But I didn't get home. I nearly got home. And then I told the taxi driver to take me down to the Bluebird Club. I was back banging on that hospital door at 2 o'clock the next morning. Wasn't too long after that, I'd come to the state where I was afraid of everything. The bank had put me on a temporary leave of absence. Dory had got a job. They just couldn't cope with me. I come to the point where I was afraid to take off my clothes at night. I don't know why. I'd sit in a chair with my hat and my coat on, waiting for this terrible thing, whatever it was going to happen. I had to be ready. Never did happen. Well, terrible things did happen, but not the ones that I was thinking of. I don't know if you have a law like we have in Canada, but as I look at it now, it was a good law. I don't really think that they had anything else they could do. It's called a family council. It's a form of interdiction. And this is another thing maybe I hope that I remember if a glass ever appears before me and I have any intention of drinking it. Because I can remember standing in front of that judge with all my family behind me. I can remember him stripping all my civil rights away from me. I couldn't vote, I couldn't have money, I couldn't have a bank account. He put me in the custody of my sister. And I was to be confined in the Verdun Protestant Hospital for the insane until they decided I was ready to come out. You know why? I'll never forget the reason why at the end of that thing. It said because I was a common drunkard and a vagabond. And I can remember that. And I can remember how I thought, how can my family do this thing to me? How can they do it? You know, all the while I suppose I knew that it was true. I can remember going down to Verdun, and I remember again the bitterness and hatred and the saying within myself, I'm going to do every single thing that these people tell me to do. Every single thing, and I'm going to get out of here quick. And when I get out, I'm going out to Vancouver, and they'll never see me again, never. I didn't. Wasn't too long till I was right back in there again. And then I came out again. The second time, my father came along and he said, you know, Dave, you aren't able to cope with the responsibilities of life. Maybe if we put you out in the country, maybe if we got a little of that old farm out at Knowlton, maybe you could raise some chickens and maybe you'd be all right. I remember that. And I was doing well. I took some prizes for setting eggs. And I was going to amount to something. And it was the kind of life I loved, really, when you come to think of it. Someday maybe I'll go back to it. I don't know. But one day down in the old house there, it's been in our family for generations, I saw up in a beam an old bottle, looked like one of those wine cellars in France. It had cobwebs and everything all over it. I took it down, I looked at it. Wasn't the kind they have in France. It was marked Dr. Somebody's bovine bronchial syrup. 40% alcohol. And pretty soon I was on my way back to the Verdun Protestant Hospital. I don't know why, you get pretty arrogant. You get on the defensive all the time for no reason whatsoever. I walked into the superintendent's office, and I said, "You'll never make me stop drinking. You can keep me here 1,000 years, but you'll never make me stop drinking." And he said, "Maybe we will, Dave, keep you here long enough." I can remember that thing went over and over in my mind. Keep you here long enough, and I was what they call a 3-time loser. And so you get frightened. And finally, when I could get near a telephone, I called Dory. You know the old story, the tears you put on, the begging and all the rest. You can't do this to me, Dory. After all these years, remember the good years. There weren't any good years. But she came down and she got me out. That's another thing I don't ever want to forget. I can remember dear old Dr. Porteous. He became a very great friend of mine later. I can remember sitting around a table with him, a little boy, Bill, Dory. I can remember the words he said. They were like a sentence of death, really. He said, "Dave is a chronic alcoholic of a type with whom we've had very little success. There's nothing more that we can do for him. You'll have to earn the money for the family. You better consider him as another one of the children. He'll probably have to have custodial care for the rest of his life." And then Dory went to live with her sister. The bank gave me a small pension, and I tried to live on that. And then started a period of 2 years. I remember parts of it I don't. I learned to drink all kinds of the various substitutes for alcohol and the pills and all the other things. Anything so you didn't have to look at yourself and see what had happened to you. There was one thing that I didn't really know if it was true or if it wasn't. I can remember walking down a street in Montreal where I thought I remembered, and things were awfully vague. A girl that was during the war pinning a white feather on me. And I can remember saying, "Well, they don't know. They don't know that I got this arm and this foot and all the rest." I can remember feeling so sorry for myself. And going down, after I've had a couple of beers, that was my stock excuse. That arm's as good as anything. I can write with it. I can do anything with it. It was a wonderful reason. I can remember I was half shot going down to the recruiting office and signing up and taking all the things. Tomorrow morning I had to report at the top of Beaver Hall Hill to the recruiting center, where they take us all in a truck across the river to be examined and all the rest of it. Inducted, I guess you call it. And I can remember phoning that Dory that night, the way we are, the grandiose characters.
Well, you won't have to be bothered with me anymore, Dory. I'll probably be killed this time, more than likely. That'll be better. You'll be better off if I am. You'll be able to marry some good guy. All the old self-pitying stories. Dory was frightened. I had a few more beers the next day, and down I went to the recruiting office. Dory says she'll never forget the day she lives. Me standing on the back of that big army truck and waving, goodbye, goodbye. A great soldier on his way off to the war. I can remember getting across the Jacquartier barracks. I can remember they left us with our shoes and socks on, so they couldn't see I had no toes on one foot to start off. I managed to come to the part where we took off our shoes and socks, and the man took one look at my foot. He says, good God, he says, we can't take you in the Army. And then I had visions of having to go back and tell them that I wasn't going to be there. I begged to talk to him. He said, well, maybe we could put you down in Long Point in some kind of a clerical job and you can look after things there. I went on a couple of more places, and finally I came to a place where there was a baize green curtain, and this was the psychiatrist. I was to go in there. I pulled the curtain across, and I stepped in, and who did I see but my dear friend, Dr. Dancy, who had just let me out of Verdun a short time before. And he said, Dave, if you were the last man in Canada, I wouldn't take you in this man's army. So I had to go crawling back. Tell them all I wasn't going to save the world and I wasn't going to get killed. It was about a year after that. It was April the 7th, I know, because it was a Good Friday in 1944. I found myself in the bullpen in number 1 police station in Montreal. I don't really have any criminal record. I haven't been in penitentiaries and I haven't been in jail, but I've been picked up a lot of times for being drunk. You know, there was something different happened to me that day. I felt alone more than I've ever felt alone. There wasn't anybody that I could turn to. There wasn't any way of being helped. There wasn't anything that I could do. I felt hopeless. I don't believe I've ever felt more hopeless. How could you talk about things like this to other people? They'd think you were crazy. They'd lock you out. They couldn't possibly understand. And the fear of what was going to happen to you. The fear of having to stay in there that weekend without a drink. Something did happen to me. I like to think that maybe that Father who looks after us all took a little pity on me, because that day I remembered a book that I had scorned, a book that I would have nothing to do with it because it talked about God and Father of Lights. I told them it sounded like a Salvation Army tract. I would have nothing to do with it. When I was locked up in Verdun, my sister had brought it all the way up from Connecticut. She'd read the Jack Alexander article in the Saturday Evening Post, and she had come up to give me this book, but I wasn't having any of it. But like most alcoholics, I had read the odd part here and there. And I remembered it spoke about people just like me, people who had found a way to get sober. People who are living ordinary, normal lives, getting up in the morning and
kissing their wives goodbye and going to work and coming home at night. And I wanted to be like that more than I wanted anything else in all this world. I hope that I may always want that more than I want anything else in all this world. I got out of there on the Tuesday morning, talked my way out on another suspended sentence. I got out to my father, who by this time had retired to the farm out in Knowlton. I asked him if I could stay there. He said, yes, you can always stay here if you don't drink. I told him about this book that Gene had brought up from Connecticut. I asked him if I could try and get in touch with these Alcoholics Anonymous people in New York. He said, what have you got to lose? And finally, after considerable difficulty, I managed to get hold on the phone of a girl named Bobby, New York General Service Office. You know the tremendous words of hope? I hope I can always remember to use them. She said, I'm an alcoholic too. There are a lot of us down here. And we found a way. And if you want it, you can have it too. You've no idea what that did to me. Here were these people, 400 or 500 miles away, that cared if I lived or if I died. These were the people that understood, I've heard people say, and oh, how they understood, and what a tremendous feeling that gave me. And just a tiny ray of hope was born. The next day, I got a lot of pamphlets and literature. The next day, I got the big book. And I read that book and read it and reread it and read it over again. I must have read it 100 times. I don't know how many times. I still read it. Because that book, oh, it was like the Bible. It gave me back my life. That and those letters that Bobby kept writing me. You know, when somebody comes around to me and said, well, it's time to make your contribution to the General Service Office, boy, I don't ever kick. I try to give as much as I possibly can, because where would I be if Bobby hadn't been there to answer that telephone? That's how I got into Alcoholics Anonymous. The rewards, as I told you, have been tremendous. They're unbelievable. I think I took the first step when one time in that old Western hospital, I didn't know I was taking the first step. When the night superintendent came into my room, and I knew her well, and she said, Mr. Bancroft, why do you do this? You've got a nice wife. You've got a nice little boy. Why do you do this? And I said, perhaps for the first time honestly, I don't know, Miss Calder. I really don't know. I think that's when I took the first step. I had a good deal of trouble with the spiritual steps. Step 2 and Step 3. And as I look back at it now, that was a kind of a pride. How now I, the great agnostic, be running around telling everybody, how could I now come back and say that I was having to go to God for help? And on top of that, there was another kind of a feeling. You know, I'd been denying God for years, and how now could I go crawling back to God and ask Him for help? There was a man from Cleveland In those days, they used to travel around a good deal, and wherever there was a loner, people came to see you. His name was Mark. And he came one day, and he was a big, tough character. And he said to me, Dave, if they tell you to stand on your head twice a day on Dominion Square, boy, you better do it. Because you don't have any other choice. And then one day, as I told you, I'm quite a dreamer, something came up into my mind that I hadn't heard for a long, long time since I was a boy. They gave it to me on the card I had when I was confirmed. It says, Lo, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone will hear my voice and open the door, I will come in. And it was Alcoholics Anonymous that showed me how to open that door. I went, I can remember when I came to the step 4 and making a moral inventory of myself. Like everybody else, I only saw the bad things. Bobby or somebody wrote me from New York and said, well, you have one asset, Dave. You're an accountant. You know what assets are. You have a desire to be sober. And I can remember making that moral inventory. I got a letter from Bill and another little phrase I've never forgotten. He said, get honest with yourself as never before. It wasn't very easy for me, to be honest. There were so many things. And then they said I had to. They didn't say I had to, but I felt I had to. I had to admit to myself, to God and to another human being, the exact nature of my wrong. And I went with fear and trembling to a clergyman that was in Montreal who had befriended me and tried to help me many, many times. And I was in earnest, and I was sincere, and I told him the whole and total story. I haven't told it all to you. There's some things that don't bear telling at meetings. There's some things I think we have to carry. Part of the price we have to pay, we have to carry in our hearts, and I don't believe that I should talk about them anyway. But there were many things. I told him all those things. I waited for the look of disgust. I waited for the scorn or whatever was going to come. There wasn't. He said, that's a tremendous thing, Dave. Tremendous. It's like original Christianity, and whatever it is, boy, you better hang on to it. I met him a couple of years ago in Toronto, the Bishop of Toronto now. And I said, you know, I never have got much farther than that. I'm not much of a churchgoer, but I have got a tremendous faith in God who's given me back my life. And he said, you know, I'm a bishop of the church, and maybe I shouldn't say it, but I'm going to say it again. Whatever it is you've got hold of, boy, you better hang on to it. And I've remembered that, and that's one of the great rewards that I have got. And to continue to make moral inventory, to make amends. I didn't have so many people, as I come to think of it, to make amends to with the ones I did. Mostly there were money I owed and bum debts and all this and that. I went around and I told them the story. 90% of them were understanding and try to help somebody who's trying to help themselves. The people that I owed things to were people like my wife, people like my father. Spent everything he'd got trying to help me. I don't know how you can repay those people other than just staying sober and doing the best you can and loving them, trying to be a decent kind of a guy. I think they feel that they've been repaid, but I hope I don't ever feel that I've completely repaid them. And then they said to continue to take moral inventory. And then they said to seek through prayer and meditation to improve my conscious contact. And I like that word conscious that goes with the conscious contact with God as I understand Him. Asking only for knowledge of His help and the power to carry it out. Of His will and the power to carry it out. You know, as I look at that, and not being too much of a churchman, seems to me really, and of course this is only my personal experience or feeling, there is only one really valid prayer. And it is, show me thy will and give me strength to do it. And then it says, having had a spiritual awakening. Experience, they used to call it in those days. I don't see how anybody possibly could go through those 11 steps sincerely and not be a changed person, and that's what a spiritual experience means. You can't be the same person because you've turned your life and your will over to God. He's looking after things for you. Your character begins to change. Begin to do different things. Where there's hate, love comes, and all the rest of it. You're not the same person. We have had a spiritual experience. And to carry this message to others who want it, we begin to think of other people even more than we think of ourselves. And to practice these principles in all our affairs. I wish I had time to tell you the tremendous rewards that Alcoholics Anonymous have given me. That little boy that sat in the doctor's office and heard me practically condemned to a life in an insane asylum, he was there to say goodbye the other morning. He's got a good job. He doesn't like drinking very much. It makes him sick. He's 22 now. I can't understand that too well, but he can't understand me. I've got a home, as long as I keep on making the payments on the mortgage. But it's ours. It isn't a house anymore. It's a home. It's a place where love is. I got my 2 little AA dividends. I remember Paul, that's my littlest one. He's 6 and named after my favorite saint. He came up to me one morning and said, Daddy, are we rich? And I said, boy, not by a long shot are we rich. Then I began to think about it. And I called him back and I said, you know, Paul, I think we're probably the richest people in all the world because we're all home here and we all love each other. There's Mary, my fat little tubby daughter. She's 10. She thinks her old man's the greatest guy in all this world. All these things Alcoholics Anonymous have given me. That father, the one I treated so badly, he died some few years ago, 6 years. I happened to be with him. I don't have any rewards in money or property or jobs or anything like that, but I wouldn't sell this one for anything anybody in the world could give me. He said, you've been a good boy, Dave, and I'm proud of you. And when we opened his will, I was his executor. That's a tremendous thing. And when I opened the safe, you know, he was quiet, reserved kind of man like New England people. Didn't talk very much. But in the safe was a for all the clippings from all the papers of everything about Alcoholics Anonymous that he'd ever found. That was a tremendous reward for me, to think of that. You couldn't buy or sell the things that AA has given me. They've given me peace. They've given the most jittery, nervous, worried kind of guy in all this world. They've given me a sort of tranquility, ability to get along, to earn a living, to look after my family. They've given me a feeling of that conscious contact with God as I understand Him, feeling that He's here and now and with me, the God within. They've given me thousands upon thousands of friends. I, that lonely man who came out of jail without a friend. I came down here, it's 1,800 miles from home. I met at least 20 people that I knew before. And those I hadn't met before were just exactly the same as old friends. That's one of the tremendous rewards that Alcoholics Anonymous has given me. It's a real miracle, you know. Nobody would give a dime for our lives. And here we are all in this room. That's one of the reasons I said if I were to give the theme or sense of this conference, I'd make it gratitude. I like the way they gave me Alcoholics Anonymous in the big book. I liked it from the very first time I read it. It's the part in the vision for you, which seems to give you the whole thing in just a very few words. It says, abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Admit your faults to Him and to your fellows. Clear away the wreckage of the past. Give freely of what you find and follow us. It's a tremendous way to live. The rewards are unbelievable. No, I don't ever have to drink again. Oh, I know I may, but I don't ever have to. I don't ever have to if I remember just one thing. I don't use it all most of the time, but tonight I'm going to. It was written by a New England poetess named Minnie Haskins. I heard it first when it was used in a Christmas message by a king of England. But to me it tells us how we can all live forever as long as God may want us to live, I mean. Without ever having to be afraid again, and that was my trouble, being afraid. It says, I said to the man who stood at the gate of the ear, give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown. And he replied, go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than a light and safer than a known way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Those of you here this afternoon, this is your first contact to make with Alcoholics Anonymous in any kind of a way. You have just witnessed just one phase, and each one of us who are members of Alcoholics Anonymous have a story of our own. And there's many, many thousands on top of thousands on top of thousands of stories in the 26 years that this program has been in action. And if there's any one of you here this afternoon who has a friend,
Make
Brother